On paper, Dustin Clark was everything you might want in a trusted caregiver. At just 30 years old, he had already carved out a steady life in Monroe, Louisiana, working in one of the most delicate and emotionally charged environments possible, the labor and delivery ward. Picture it. New parents clinging to every breath, every sound, every tiny movement as their babies entered the world, and Dustin right there, the man in scrubs who made sure everything went smoothly. Nurses like him are often described as angels in hospitals. They are the calm in the storm, the steady hand in moments of chaos. And for a while, Dustin seemed to fit that description perfectly. He was well-liked among his co-workers at St. Francis Medical Center. Colleagues said he had a good bedside manner, the kind of personality that put anxious families at ease. In a town where people knew each other and reputations carried weight, Dustin appeared to have built one of trust and reliability. He wasn't just some anonymous figure hidden in the background of hospital life. He was the man you hoped would be assigned to your family's delivery. And then there was the story he presented outside of work. The story of a man embracing fatherhood in what seemed like the most loving way possible. Just recently, Dustin had adopted a 5-month-old baby boy. Adoption is never a small step. It speaks of commitment, of a conscious decision to bring a child into your home and claim them as your own. For many, that act alone earns respect. Dustin certainly seemed proud of his decision. On Facebook and Instagram, he would post pictures of his little boy, showing off father-son moments that could melt even the coldest heart. There he was, smiling broadly, the baby tucked against his chest or resting peacefully in his arms. To the outside world, it looked like a man who had it all together. Think about that for a moment. A nurse, trained to care for newborns. A man who chose adoption, proudly stepping into single fatherhood. A person who presented himself as kind, patient, and loving. If you saw his posts or met him in passing, you might even describe him as inspirational. And maybe that's why what came next felt so jarring, so unsettling. Because the truth about Dustin Clark was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Behind closed doors, away from the soft lighting of hospital rooms and the carefully curated snapshots of social media, something was breaking. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was something far more disturbing, a streak of anger or even cruelty that no one had dared to suspect. Whatever the cause, the tension in Dustin's home was building like a quiet storm. His friends didn't notice it, his co-workers didn't suspect it, and his online followers certainly couldn't see it. But in the shadows of his private life, cracks were beginning to show. The image of perfection, the nurse, the doting father, the man of responsibility was just that, an image. And as we often find in these dark patterns of human behavior, images can deceive. They can blind us to the truth until the truth explodes in a way that can no longer be ignored. One night, in May of 2023, everything changed. Dustin's 5-month-old baby, the child he had sworn to protect, was rushed to the hospital with injuries that no infant should ever endure. Doctors examining the baby found something horrifying. A fractured skull. Let that sink in. A baby who should have been safe, who should have been cherished, was instead clinging to life with a devastating injury. An injury that, according to medical professionals, almost certainly came from blunt force trauma. Now here's where the story takes an even darker turn. In the initial scramble for answers, Dustin offered up an explanation, but it was far from convincing. He told investigators that the baby had been crying uncontrollably and, in his words, he lost his patience. He admitted to forcefully hitting the back of the baby's head against his chest. Yes, you heard that right. A labor and delivery nurse, someone entrusted with fragile newborns every single day, confessed to striking his own 5-month-old child with enough force to fracture his skull. When police documented the case, they didn't mince words. Their report painted a picture of frustration boiling over into violence, of a father who had crossed a line that should never be crossed. The words themselves, "lost patience," are haunting. Any parent will tell you that infants cry, sometimes for hours on end, and it can fray nerves. But there's a gulf, a vast chasm, between feeling frustration and acting on it in such a violent, destructive way. Dustin admitted he bridged that gap. News of the arrest spread quickly, and shock rippled through Monroe. The idea that someone so trusted, so embedded in the delicate world of caring for mothers and babies, could do something so unthinkable, it rattled people to their core. And it wasn't just the local community watching. The story caught national attention, appearing in outlets across the U.S. The contradictions were too striking to ignore. The healer turned abuser. The father turned threat. And here's the part that adds another chilling layer. While Dustin's baby was recovering in the hospital, his own mother, yes, the child's grandmother, took to Facebook in a fiery defense of her son. She painted him as misunderstood, even targeted, and described the allegations as twisted. To her, this wasn't the full story. To many outsiders, though, her words seemed like a desperate attempt to protect him from accountability. Her posts sparked heated debates, with some supporting her and others horrified that a grandmother could dismiss such severe injuries as anything less than abuse. So how does a man who spent his career bringing life into the world, a man who publicly celebrated fatherhood, end up accused of nearly taking life away from the one person who depended on him most? That's the question investigators, prosecutors, and the public would grapple with as this case unfolded. And in that question lies the unsettling truth about the masks people wear and the dark patterns they hide beneath. When news of Dustin Clark's arrest hit Monroe, it wasn't just another crime headline, it was a shockwave. The very people who once entrusted him with their newborns now found themselves rereading the story, asking if it could possibly be true. Could the gentle, calm nurse they remembered from the delivery room really be the same man accused of violently fracturing his own baby's skull? Law enforcement wasted no time digging deeper. According to official records, the investigation began immediately after the 5-month-old was brought to the hospital. Doctors who examined the infant quickly raised red flags. A skull fracture in a baby so young isn't something that happens from rolling off a bed or bumping into a crib. It's the kind of injury that makes professionals stop and say, "This doesn't add up." And so, by law, they alerted authorities. Detectives sat down with Dustin, and what unfolded in that interrogation room would become central to the case. At first, Dustin's explanations wavered, but eventually he admitted what he called a moment of lost patience. He described holding the baby as the child cried endlessly, and in frustration, slamming the back of the baby's head against his own chest. Think about that detail for a moment. He wasn't denying the act. He wasn't claiming the injury was accidental. He confessed to letting his emotions override his responsibility as a father. That admission, recorded in the case file, was damning. The Ouachita Parish Sheriff's Office charged Dustin Clark with second-degree cruelty to juveniles, a serious felony in Louisiana law. Under the statute, second-degree cruelty applies when someone intentionally or recklessly causes serious bodily harm to a child. It carries a potential prison sentence of up to 40 years. That's not just a slap on the wrist, it's the kind of charge that can strip a person of their freedom for most of their adult life. As word spread, Dustin's workplace had no choice but to respond. St. Francis Medical Center, the hospital where he worked, released a statement almost immediately. It was clear and unambiguous. Dustin Clark was no longer employed there. The hospital distanced itself from him, emphasizing that the allegations did not reflect their values or their standards of patient care. For the staff, many of whom had worked alongside him in tense, intimate delivery rooms, it was surreal. One day he was their colleague, the next he was splashed across headlines as a child abuser. And then came the court appearances. Dustin stood before a judge, facing the formal weight of the charges. His demeanor was quiet, even subdued, as reporters documented the moment. The man once celebrated as a caregiver now wore the heavy label of defendant. His bond was set, and while some whispered that his family might rally around him, others recoiled at the idea that anyone would defend a man who had admitted to harming a baby. This is where his mother's role became one of the strangest twists in the story. Just days after Dustin's arrest, she logged onto Facebook and launched into a defense of her son. She insisted the allegations were exaggerated, twisted by investigators, and that Dustin was being unfairly vilified. She described him as a loving father who had made a mistake, but didn't deserve the level of outrage he was facing. Her words stirred intense reactions online. Some commenters sympathized, suggesting that maybe people didn't understand the pressures of single fatherhood, but the majority were outraged. "How can you minimize a fractured skull?" one commenter asked. "This isn't just a mistake, this is abuse." The debate highlighted a painful truth. When abuse cases hit close to home, families often struggle to accept reality. To Dustin's mother, his son wasn't a criminal, he was still her child. But to the rest of the world, her defense looked like denial, a refusal to acknowledge the suffering of her grandson. That clash between personal loyalty and objective truth played out in public, with strangers watching and weighing in. Meanwhile, prosecutors quietly built their case. They gathered medical reports, police statements, and Dustin's own admissions. They interviewed hospital staff and neighbors, piecing together a timeline. And behind all of it was the little boy, still recovering, still too young to understand what had happened, but living proof of the violence he had endured. What made this case so unsettling wasn't just the act itself, but the irony of Dustin's profession. Nurses, especially those in labor and delivery, are often called the guardians of life. They witness both the fragility and the miracle of newborns, sometimes holding them before even their parents do. For Dustin to cross the line into harming a baby, his own baby, was not just criminal. It felt like a betrayal of the very core of his identity. He had taken the oath to care, to heal, and he had shattered it in the most personal, irreversible way. The community response reflected that betrayal. Parents who once felt reassured by seeing Dustin in the delivery room now shuddered at the thought. Co-workers who had once trusted him with critical tasks now avoided even saying his name. Neighbors spoke in whispers, recalling how they had seen him pushing a stroller or carrying the baby into the house, never imagining what might be happening behind closed doors. By the time Dustin's mugshot circled news outlets nationwide, the story had transformed into something larger than just one man's crime. It became a cautionary tale about appearances, about the thin line between patience and violence, and about how quickly a life built on trust can collapse. For Dustin, there was no going back. His career was gone, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom hanging in the balance. For his son, the journey was just beginning, one marked by trauma before he could even form memories. And for the community, the case served as a reminder of an unsettling truth. Sometimes the people we trust most with life are capable of destroying it. The story of Dustin Clark didn't end with his arrest. If anything, that was just the beginning of a long and complicated legal journey. Courtrooms are strange theaters where truth, perception, and strategy collide. And in cases like this, every word, every piece of evidence, and every facial expression matters. When Dustin first appeared in court,
the weight of the charges became painfully clear. Second-degree cruelty to juveniles isn't a charge that prosecutors throw around lightly. It carries a potential sentence of up to 40 years in prison, nearly a lifetime. For Dustin, it meant that everything he had built, his career, his reputation, his carefully constructed image, was now on the line. And unlike the carefully polished persona he once displayed on social media, there was no filter here, just a man accused of betraying the most sacred role, that of a parent. The prosecution leaned heavily on Dustin's own words. His admission, "I lost patience," was simple but devastating. In the courtroom, those words became more than a statement. They became the prosecution's entire narrative. Here was a man trained to protect infants, admitting that he let his frustration lead to violence against a baby. And not just any baby, his own adopted son. Prosecutors argued this wasn't an accident. It was a conscious failure of control that resulted in a catastrophic injury. But the defense had its own playbook. Attorneys argued that Dustin wasn't a monster, but a man under pressure. They pointed to the exhaustion of single fatherhood, the endless cycle of sleepless nights, and the challenges of caring for an infant who could not yet communicate. They suggested that Dustin's actions weren't born of malice, but of desperation, a tragic lapse in judgment. Their goal was to humanize him, to frame the incident as a mistake rather than a deliberate act of cruelty. Here's where the courtroom dynamics became fascinating. Expert witnesses were brought in to testify about the medical evidence. Pediatric specialists explained what kind of force would be required to cause a skull fracture in a 5-month-old. They described the vulnerability of an infant's skull, the way bones are still forming, and how even a blow that might not injure an adult could be devastating to a baby. The conclusion was unavoidable. The injury wasn't minor, and it wasn't an accident. It was the result of significant force. On the other side, defense experts tried to raise doubt. Could the injury have happened differently? Could a fall, a stumble, or even rough play have produced similar results? But the prosecution countered with Dustin's own confession. Why speculate when the defendant himself had already admitted what he did? That confession closed doors that the defense desperately wanted to keep open. The courtroom also became a battleground for public perception. Every hearing was covered by local media, and sometimes national outlets picked up the story. Reporters highlighted the irony: a nurse trusted with life, now accused of harming it. Headlines leaned into the betrayal, framing Dustin not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of how appearances can deceive. For Dustin's family, the experience was agonizing. His mother, who had already taken to Facebook in his defense, continued to stand by him. She insisted that the narrative painted by prosecutors was unfair, that her son was being demonized for one moment of weakness. But the courtroom was not Facebook. Here, sympathy and denial weren't enough. The facts ruled, and the facts were grim. Attorneys watching the case from the outside noted how unusual it was. Cases of child abuse sadly aren't rare, but what made this one stand out was Dustin's profession. The fact that he worked in labor and delivery wasn't just background, it was a central part of why the story carried so much weight. As one legal analyst put it, this isn't just about a man accused of hurting a child. It's about a man whose entire career was built on protecting children. That contradiction makes the case uniquely powerful in front of a jury. And then came the question of sentencing. If convicted, how harsh should the punishment be? Prosecutors argued that the betrayal of trust demanded a severe sentence. They said Dustin's role as a nurse and a father made his crime even more egregious, not less. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency. They painted Dustin as someone who could be rehabilitated, someone who needed counseling, not decades behind bars.
But here's the haunting truth. Regardless of what the court decided, the baby's life had already been forever altered. Even if the child healed physically, the trauma of those early months, of being harmed by the person who should have been the safest, would linger. Trauma leaves marks that medical scans can't always capture. That fact hung over the proceedings like a shadow, reminding everyone that the victim here couldn't testify, couldn't explain, couldn't even understand what had happened. As the case unfolded, one theme became impossible to ignore: the fragility of the image we create versus the reality behind it. Dustin's social media, full of smiling pictures with his baby, now looked sinister. Every photo became a reminder of how deceiving appearances can be. Neighbors who once admired his commitment to fatherhood now whispered about what other secrets he might have hidden. Colleagues who had respected him at the hospital wondered if they had ever really known him at all. The courtroom drama stretched on, but with each passing day, Dustin's life as he had once known it slipped further away. The hospital job was gone. The trust of his community was gone. And his future rested entirely in the hand of a system that does not easily forgive crimes against children. For the public, watching from the outside, the question wasn't just whether Dustin Clark was guilty. It was how a man who had built his life around the care of newborns could allow frustration to lead to violence. And that question, more than any legal argument, is what made the case unforgettable. When the gavel finally fell on the case of Dustin Clark, what lingered wasn't just the details of his crime. It was the larger questions his story forced us to ask. Because this case wasn't only about one man, one baby, or one fractured skull. It was about trust, betrayal, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the very people we believe to be protectors can become threats. Think about the layers of betrayal wrapped up in this case. Dustin wasn't just a father. He was an adoptive father. Adoption is a choice, a deliberate act of stepping into responsibility. He wasn't bound by biology or forced into the role. He chose it. He filled out the paperwork, went through the process, looked into that baby's eyes and declared, "You are mine. I will protect you." And yet when the moment came where protection was needed most, he became the danger. That alone is chilling. Then there was his profession. A nurse in labor and delivery is supposed to embody compassion and steadiness. In those high-stakes hours when mothers labor and newborns cling to life, families put everything, absolutely everything, into the hands of medical staff. Dustin was one of those hands. He was trained to cradle fragile heads, to monitor the faintest cries, to know exactly how vulnerable infants are. But instead of applying that knowledge to safeguard his son, he weaponized it. He knew how delicate the baby's skull was. He knew how much force it would take, and he admitted that he applied it anyway. These contradictions, the father who harms, the nurse who abuses, are what made Dustin Clark's story bigger than a single headline. They speak to something deeper, the dark patterns of human behavior, the cracks that form beneath the polished surface of who we present ourselves to be. On social media, Dustin looked like the model father. Scroll through his pictures and you'd see smiles, bonding moments, the image of a man proud of his child. But social media is a stage, and Dustin's performance was convincing. It fooled neighbors, coworkers, maybe even himself. And yet the truth,
The unfiltered, brutal truth was playing out off-screen. It makes you wonder, how many other people live behind masks this convincing? How many others post smiling pictures while hiding the storm building inside? This is why the case of Dustin Clark rattled not just Monroe, but everyone who heard about it. Because it forced us to admit that appearances are fragile and trust is a gamble. We want to believe that nurses are healers, that fathers are protectors, that adoptive parents are heroes. Most of the time, that's true. But cases like this remind us that there are exceptions, and those exceptions are devastating. From a systemic perspective, this case also raised questions about adoption screening and support. Was Dustin properly prepared for the realities of caring for an infant? Did the adoption process identify his potential for frustration or violence? Should single parents adopting infants receive more guidance, more check-ins, more counseling? These aren't easy questions, but they matter. Because at the end of the day, adoption isn't just paperwork. It's a lifelong commitment. And in this case, that commitment fell apart in less than 6 months. For legal analysts, the case also became a study in how the justice system handles child abuse. Prosecutors wanted the harshest penalty possible, not just to punish Dustin, but to send a message. Harming a child, especially in such a brutal way, will not be tolerated. The defense wanted leniency, arguing that Dustin's crime came from exhaustion and frustration, not malice. But here's the truth. Intent doesn't erase impact. That baby's fractured skull was not healed by explanations, and the trauma inflicted couldn't be undone by apologies. And that leads us to the most haunting part of all. The baby. Too young to testify. Too young to even understand what happened. For him, the entire ordeal will live in medical charts and legal documents, not in memory. But the consequences will ripple through his life in ways no court ruling can measure. That's the tragedy at the heart of this story. Not Dustin Clark's fall of grace, but the suffering of a child who never asked for any of it. As the dust settled, the community in Monroe carried away a scar of its own. For some, it was a loss of innocence, a realization that even those we hold up as guardians can fail in catastrophic ways. For others, it was a warning to pay closer attention, to question what lies behind the polished images we see online and in public. And for us, watching from the outside, it becomes a reflection on the fragile line between patience and violence. How many times have we all felt frustration boil up in us? How many times have we faced the cry of a baby, the tantrum of a child, the chaos of daily stress? Most of us step back, breathe, find a way to cope. But Dustin Clark didn't. And in that failure, he revealed the darkest pattern of all. The one where love, responsibility, and trust collapse into harm.
So, what do we do with a story like this? Do we file it away as just another shocking crime? Do we demonize Dustin and move on? Or do we let it sit with us, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable reality that people aren't always who they appear to be? That's the challenge this case leaves us with. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just the story of Dustin Clark. It was the story of a child whose first experience of trust ended in betrayal. It was the story of a community learning that even heroes can fall. And it was a reminder to all of us to look closer, to question harder, and to never assume that the surface tells the whole truth. This is the dark pattern of Dustin Clark's life, a pattern of deception, betrayal, and violence hidden beneath the mask of perfection. And if there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this: trust should be earned carefully, because once it's broken, the damage can last forever.